All right. Well, what a wild text this was in church this week as we talked about the church's tolerance of sexual sin. And obviously, in our culture, there are a lot of churches that are bowing their knee to sexual sin in the hopes that more people would come with the belief that that's more loving. And this text is really clear that is unloving, and it is really a flawed plan if you think you're going to win people to Jesus by acting like Satan. And so we can't use the methods and the temptations of the world to try to lead people to Christ. And Paul's really strong. Hey, you can't tolerate sexual sin. You need to, for those who claim to be Christians who are walking in sexual sin, and that's any sexual sin, Paul says, that it's ongoing, unrepentant, willful, maybe it's premarital sex, extramarital sex, same sex, whatever it is. Paul goes, hey, if that person claims to be in Christ and is a member at that church has a responsibility to discipline that person. And as we said, it brings up all kinds of objections like, aren't we not supposed to judge? And I love what Paul says here. He goes, listen, I'm not talking about not associating with non-Christians. He's like, of course non-Christians are acting like non-Christians. He goes, I'm talking about Christians. I'm talking about those who walk with Jesus or profess to walk with Jesus, and yet their lifestyles are in rebellion to Jesus, and they're unrepentant. They don't care. And one of the dangers really of churches is that what happens a lot of times, and this really is what you see when churches tend to stagnate on the mission that God gives them, is they are judging the world, judging the lost, who are acting like the lost, but they stand in judgment on the lost, and they ignore their own sins. They ignore their greed. They ignore their gluttony. They ignore their own lack of mission. They ignore their spiritual apathy. And that's the worst. Paul says, no, this should be the exact opposite. We should be calling each other to holiness and then loving those who don't know Jesus. So I hope you guys spend a little time talking about two things. One, what happens to a church that forgets to be befriending those outside of the church, to be building relationships with sinners, with people who are in, whether it's sexual sin or addiction or greed or whatever. How are we building relationships with them? How are we challenging one another to grow in holiness and not accepting just a rebellion to Christ? How are we making sure we're doing what Paul calls the church in Corinth? And then personally, how can you all be praying for each other to be strategic in building relationships with those that don't know Jesus in the hopes that they'd come to know Jesus? And so, as we always say, we want the people of North Jersey, if they're going to choose hell, to have to crawl over us to get there. And so let's not be judgmental towards non-Christians, but let's be calling one another who are Christians to a holy life. All right, I hope you have a great discussion tonight, and look forward to hearing how it goes.